Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Dundee and to our kick-off event of the Saturday Series 2021. The Saturday Series is Scotland's oldest continuous free public lecture series and will celebrate their centenary year in 2024, annually attracting thousands of people to engage with our prestigious world-class speakers. I'm John Rowan, I'm the Vice Principal for Research in the University of Dundee, and I'm honoured to be your host for this first event of 2021, the Climate Emergency, Local Responses to a Global Menace. In normal times, these events would be held on campus with audiences of several hundred filling our largest lecture theatres. And in fact, this event was originally scheduled for March last year, but had to be cancelled because of that other now familiar menace, COVID-19, which unfortunately continuously prevents us from being together in person. However, there is a digital upside. We've now sold out over 400 registered tickets for tonight, and hopefully you, our audience, are all safely ensconced at home, wherever you are in the world, and ready to actively engage. It's a positive unintended consequence of the pandemic that these events developed in partnership with our city can now reach a global audience, with multiple continents beaming in for this event and enabling many of our alumni to reconnect with their alma mater. So tonight I'm going to introduce you, channeling my inner Vivaldi, to four seasoned professors, each internationally leading in their respective fields, and give each just a few minutes, 4 to be precise, to offer you, our audience, a provocation around the climate emergency and our local responses to that global menace. So tonight we'll hear about the scientific evidence defining the emergency, the international governance frameworks seeking to provide regulation, policy and practice at the national scale, and then how people are responding individually and in groups in terms of tackling the response. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to each of our speakers, and I hope that they'll sequentially flash up on the screen. Firstly, we're going to hear from Professor Sue Dawson. Sue's the head of Geography and Environmental Science and Professor of Hazard Geoscience in the University of Dundee. She's an expert in extreme coastal change and works extensively on tsunamis and storm processes. Next, we're going to hear from Professor Volker Roeben. Volker's Professor of Energy Law, International Law and Global Regulation. He's a renowned expert on energy law with public and international law and has published many books and articles on the European Energy Union. We'll then go to Professor Pete Fox. Pete's Director of Operations for the Environment Agency of England and an honorary professor in the University of Dundee. He's been with the Environment Agency for nearly 30 years in a variety of regulatory, operational and strategic positions concerning climate change, biodiversity and flood risk management. And then we'll hear from Professor Mel Woods. Mel is Professor of Creative Intelligence in our art school, DJ CAD, and leads the multi-award winning GROW Observatory, which has been empowering thousands of volunteers across Europe and beyond to tackle environmental issues by bringing about change to their local communities. As I say, the format of tonight's event, which means we've only got a precious hour together, is that each of our panel will have 4 minutes. After that, I will probably ruthlessly try and cut them off. And after we've heard from all 4 speakers, we'll move into the audience-led Q&A. Now, I hope that many of you are already experts in Teams or Zoom or WebEx or whatever your digital platform of choice is. So I hope you can see that on the screen that you're looking at, there's an opportunity by looking at the speech bubble symbol up in the top right for you to be able to post a question to the speakers. What we'll do is we'll hear from each of the speakers in turn, and then we'll try and look at the questions that have come through from you, our audience, and then I'll try and bundle them together and try and then curate and host that question and answer session that will follow thereafter. So there is a limit of the technology that sometimes we get these slightly jumpy transitions. So try and bear with us. We'll hopefully try and give you as much of a in-the-room experience as we possibly can. So let's, without further ado, move to our first speaker, who's going to talk to us on the nature of the evidence. and we'll hear from Professor Sue Dawson. So over to you, Sue. Thank you.
Thanks, John. First slide, please. We understand climate changes and the impact on the environment much more than we ever had. The climate debate is all around us, and we need to think about whether we have answers to many of these bigger questions. Do we understand the uncertainties around environmental changes, or are we comfortable with the changes that exist around us? We're all living with environmental change at a global and a local level. 2020 saw a really turbulent year with unprecedented wildfires in Australia and California and ever-rising atmospheric CO2 levels. I was born when global CO2 levels were at 323 parts per million, and 50 years later they sit at 417, and they were last at this rate 4 million years ago. Interestingly, the pandemic at the moment has not seen a dramatic fall in CO2 levels, despite the almost total reduction of global air travel. Recent catastrophic landslide and debris flow in the Himalayas is really testament to a combination of changes in both slope stability, steep confined valley slopes, and the density of populations. Closer to home, we see flooding due to storms, including Storm Dennis, Storm Kiara that you see on the screen, and repeated landslides associated with extremes of rainfall and an increase in the intensity of these events. Next slide. This is a famous slide, and it's Michael Mann's famous hockey stick graph of temperature. We see this vertical takeoff in the 20th century seen here in red on the graph. This represents the blade of that hockey stick. This dramatic rise in temperature is really coupled with a dramatic warming that we see in the Arctic and the polar regions at the moment. And an ever-increasing temperature rise makes the past decade the warmest on record. In some places, a temperature of 38 degrees was recorded in Siberia in June of last year. In 2020 saw the second lowest on record in terms of sea ice extent in these polar regions. This loss of ice is both a symptom of climate change as well as a driver of the change, because the ice reflects the heat, but ever larger areas of open water absorb that heat, thus fueling our global warming, you see. We see record losses of permafrost associated with these temperatures as well, and this accelerates the thaw and unlocks stores of carbon and methane, thus releasing more into the atmosphere. We understand much about the importance of forests, and since 1990 there's been over 170 million hectares of loss across the tropics, Indonesia, Brazil, the Congo, etc. And there's a mission to plant 1 million trees to absorb this carbon. This may help the last decade, but can't really provide the solutions on its own. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. This is a really striking infographic, and it's designed by Ed Hawkins, a climate scientist from Reading, and it really strikes a note with the general public on how data visualization can really help communicate climate science. It was downloaded more than 1 million times in the first week that it was published. We see it on buses, t-shirts, even as a stage backdrop to a rock concert. And it shows the average temperature for every year in the form of a coloured stripe, blue shades being cooler and red warmer. Here it's incredibly clear to see the influence of human-induced climate change just in one view. Do check out the website to see the pattern for all regions across the globe. Really, our human activities in our cities really lie at the root of this descent into the climate chaos we see. But we also can help provide the solutions, and we'll see more of those as we go through this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. That was excellent. So, audience, I think we've got the case for the fact that we've got this unprecedented level of change within our global climate system. I'm going to pass you now, thanking Sue, over to Professor Volker Roeben, who's going to take us in terms of the story with respect to international regulation and governance. Volker, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. First slide, please. Yeah, thank you. This is as was said, this is an unprecedented challenge. It's actually the largest and most demanding task that humanity has ever set itself. And this is the response so far. It is about making new international law to signal to everyone that this is an irreversible and transformative process. This is based on international law conventions, and particularly the Paris Agreement in 2015. I can't go into any details about this, but the key thing is that every state in the world is party to it. And most importantly, also the largest emitters. Now, this is this slide shows you that the US has recently rejoined this treaty, and the message that this sends is hard to overestimate. This is for all states, and particularly, as a matter of fairness, those that have the most to contribute. Next slide, please. Yeah, and how does the Paris Agreement approach this task? It's fundamentally bottom up. So every state determines its own contribution. It sets its level of ambition, and then it is subject to accountability to all others. It's peer pressure that works best. And this is the registry of these nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And you see them state by state. You can see exactly what everyone is ready to contribute. Next slide, please. Yeah, and the other important thing about the Paris Agreement is that it sets an objective about where to halt the global temperature rise. Now, that's incredibly important. It's a great step forward by the Paris Agreement. But it gives us choice, and you see this here. There are two. The objective can be between 2 degrees Celsius global warming or 1.5 degrees. This is a huge difference, and the question is still which one the International Committee will commit to. The slides here give you a chance, or an image of what needs to be done to remain at 1 point to hit this target of the sweet spot, if I may say so, of 1.5 degrees global warming. And you effectively see on that slide that's been prepared by the International Energy Agency. You see that this is fundamentally about if we want to go for 2050 net zero target, then the action must happen by 2030. That's really what we should aim for, and you see that there are 3 big sectors that make contribution. It's the largest contribution from the power sector, new end users demanding effectively disruptive technologies, but also behavior change. So these 3 sectors must work together to achieve that target. And of course, that is exactly what Glasgow, the COP26 coming up in November is all about. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Volker. Excellent. So that audience is the global governing frameworks within which we're trying to respond to the climate change emergency. We're going to come down in scale now, and I'll bring you over to Professor Pete Fox, who's going to explore with us some of the national policy and practice developments that he's very familiar with. So thank you, Pete.
Thank you, John. Next slide, please. So I work for the Environment Agency. It's a large environmental regulator covering the whole of England. And this slide shows our responsibilities when it comes to managing carbon. And I'd like to draw your attention to the second series of rings, the purple, orangey, red and green. And those are the 3 principal responsibilities of the Environment Agency. So as a regulator, we regulate the power industry and the chemical industry and most other big emitters of carbon dioxide. And our job is to set for them limits on emissions of key pollutants. So we are working with them to regulate and innovate for carbon emissions We are responsible for managing the trading scheme for carbon across the UK, and we are pushing hard for a circular economy through our regulatory responsibilities. We're also an operator. We build flood defences, and we set targets for flood resilience around England. And in building our flood defences, we clearly do modelling and management of river levels. And in so doing, actually, we use an awful lot of concrete, which itself is a carbon intensive material. But we are adapting to, during our operational activities, adapting to a changing climate. But more importantly, as a leader in environmental regulation, our responsibility is to walk the walk ourselves. And we have committed to becoming a net zero organisation by 2030, some 20 years earlier than the UK government. And we are an arm's length body of UK government. And setting that 2030 target was politically very sensitive 2 years ago, and we're on that road now. Next slide, please. So I'd like to offer you three observations and reflections on the early journey to get to net zero.
Excuse me, Pete, can I just interrupt you a second? My slide show is showing a blurred image. I'm just making sure it could possibly just be me, but can...
How's it looking?
I think we're just having a slight technical problem, but of course you can please just carry on, Pete, and then we'll the slides, I hope, will catch up with your.
You're not missing anything particularly pretty, folks. There are 3 bullet points on this slide. The first is that policy is easy. It's easy to set the net zero policy. It is quite something else to actually implement it. And what we are seeing now is an awful lot of debate within government and across government on how you implement a policy of net zero. The Crown Commercial Service, the driver of procurement for the government, are now starting to wake up to the fact that they are going to have to drive very hard their procurement to achieve net zero. Frankly, they're finding it incredibly difficult to make that jump, and we're helping them with that. The second is that actually, as the UK economy, it's quite straightforward for us to set ourselves a net zero target, because we've offshored much of our carbon emissions. Manufacturing is largely undertaken in Asia, in China in particular. And so we need to be very careful that we don't look at our progress towards net zero and start to polish our halos, because, to be honest, we are exporting our emissions. They're happening elsewhere. And thirdly, reporting is tough. Accounting is vague and uncertain. And so actually getting a standard set of accounting measures and accounting for offsetting is very difficult. There is no standard out there. And so it's easy for people to double count, triple count their contributions. So let me give you an example. We anticipate that in the Environment Agency, we will achieve a further reduction by up to 45% of our total emissions by 2030, meaning we are going to have to try and find offsetting for 55%. And we estimate that 55% of carbon emissions translated to tree planting would require more trees planted than were planted in the whole of the UK last year. And so actually we think the challenge of achieving net zero is huge and will test us all. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Pete. Apologies, audience, for a slight technical hiccup there. These things happen with very large numbers. So an excellent overview of the UK position. Thank you very much, Pete Fox. And now we're going to move to our final speaker, who's Professor Mel Woods, and she's going to share her experiences around developing a very significant programme of citizen activation and citizen science responses to climate change. So thank you, Mel, over to you.
Thank you, John. Yes, good evening, everybody, and very happy to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about people and agency, and most importantly, I think the effects that the impending or the climate disaster that we're facing can often have, which can be quite debilitating. You might wonder as an individual, what actually can I do about this? Is it going to make any difference that I cycle to work every day like I do, or that I use reusable bags instead of plastic bags, or even that I try to buy differently, for instance? What difference can that actually make? Is that a drop in the ocean too far? What about governments? What about industry? What are they doing? One of the real areas of transformation that we're seeing that has actually been around for a very long time began with the Great Bird Count. That was a leisure activity designed by the Victorians to count birds at Christmas, and has since built up a huge data set of patterns of bird migration, and other initiatives such as the bee count, where you, and many of you may have taken part, going out into your gardens in the summer to spot bees and respond to the Natural History Museum's index in order to see which bees are thriving and which are not. Those are examples of citizen science, and citizen science is going through not only a renaissance but a transformation in the way that citizens are collaborating with scientists and actually meeting some of these data challenges that Pete has started to talk about there in a really interesting way, and has the potential, we think, to contribute to the development and the measuring of some of the indicators and breaking down into the smaller chunks of the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's SDGs. So citizen science has the potential. It grounded itself in ecology. But the difference is now is that citizens and the role of citizens are becoming embedded. It's becoming a far more collaborative and co-created endeavour between individuals, communities and science themselves, and even local authorities are getting involved. And they're experiencing coming into projects and being involved because they're experiencing everyday issues in their lives that they feel are important to them. So we have been developing projects starting with things like air pollution, looking at measuring that in urban cities, but with a real change making agenda and designing the process of science and the gathering of data together. And here you can see with GROW, we've been working on soil. So we developed quite early on a value system where we're looking not only to meet the top-down scientific agenda, but also the bottom-up community agenda, which is supporting a movement of citizens and communities generating and sharing and using data. And in the GROW Observatory, the example is on soil health and growing and land practices. If we can move to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we do and believe in very strongly is open science, and open science means using, for us as designers and makers, open hardware, open software. So open hardware might be sensors, open software is anybody can design and contribute to software, opening up the science, opening up the tools and the methods and the resources. And our aim is to share best practices and toolkits so that anyone can use those, anyone can take part and learn, and anyone can join a citizen science project. And here is one example that we're extremely proud of. Citizen science projects, how to make a difference on FutureLearn. You can sign up now. It starts again on the 22nd of March this year. And this has been a fantastic training resource for many of the people that have joined, not only from citizens, but also from scientific organisations. And last slide, please. But who are the people that join, and who are the people that have made change? Here we can see just a selection of the 24 communities that have placed over 6,000 sensors in the past 3 years, gathering millions of rows of data in order to monitor soil moisture, and actually Ground Truth Sentinel-1, which is the family of satellites that are monitoring the kinds of extreme weather events such as flooding, etc., and warming events that are threatening and as a result of climate change. You can see them here from all over the world, and we have one, of course, here in Scotland, in Angus, just up the road. So their stories are extremely important. There's stories of success, and we use design, art, storytelling, data visualization, as Sue's described previously, in order to spread and scale. But that is the challenge. How do we as individuals get involved in these initiatives? How do we spread and how do we scale and engage people around us? And how do we really create a global movement of resilience in order to gather this kind of data, to make evidence, use that data for ourselves, and give that data also to science? And on that note, I shall end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mel. So back to me. Thank you, our speakers. I think we've heard from 4 internationally renowned experts, each with specific domain knowledge in their respective areas. And we're on a very broad canvas with respect to the climate emergency and how we generate responses to it. When we did the initial registration, as we mentioned, there was something in the order of 400 registrations made for tonight's event. And one of the things that happened with that is we invited colleagues to pre-post questions that they might have for the panel. So we've got dozens of questions that have come in from the pre-registration process, and a number of those I've actually posted into the chat already, just to seed the pot, as it were. And then we've had a significant number of questions now coming in from yourselves in the audience. So I think what we'll do is just begin with the question from Joe, which is, how is the economic effect of COVID going to affect our ability to achieve net zero and the other changes that we need to make? So I'm going to start with you, Pete, and then I'm going to move across to the other members of the panel and maybe just take you each in turn. My original idea is that we would have come to each of you for your respective talks, but I think, considering where we are in terms of the schedule, we'll just start with a general question and we'll move it through the panel. So if I could start with you first, Pete, economic effect of COVID affecting our ability to achieve the net zero targets. Thank you.
Thank you. Gosh, yes, I think there has been a real tension around delivering public goods and generating taxation. And traditionally, I think taxation has been levelled at employment. And I think the government and the Treasury actually in the UK government have cottoned on to the need to link taxation to climate, and they are driving that quite hard, as well as public policy around investment in carbon neutral energy technologies. And I must say I am cautiously optimistic actually around the way this government is driving public good. It will be really interesting to see whether the budget next week changes the landscape on taxation. And if that doesn't, I would expect the British government to do something quite totemic for COP26 in Glasgow later this year. They've been actually remarkably quiet in the last 4 or 5 months about taxation and its driver for carbon, despite the fact there are a number of select committees and audit committees that are driving it very hard. I hope that helps, John.
I think it does help. It was very good, Pete. And I'm going to bridge across now from that response to Volker and build in a question that came from an audience member, Rowan, which was talking about the idea of carbon and making it more understood within the community. So, Volker, I wonder, in terms of your expertise in national and international regulation and the ways in which we can use policy to affect change, would you like to just pick up the ideas there that Pete was developing around how we actually make a formal response?
Yeah, thank you very much, John and Pete. I think this is the response is twofold. We need both. We need regulation, and we need a new large push of investment. And regulation means effectively suppression of carbon, and that's done quite effectively in many countries now through a cap put on the large emitters, the emissions trading system. I can't go into details here, but that's being spread out across the world. We have that in Europe, we have that in China now coming on stream. That's the regulatory part. But in fact, what is really required in addition to this is a complete re-steering of investment away from traditional industries towards low carbon energy and other industry forms. That's the key thing. It's in the order of trillions. And the interesting and maybe paradoxical effect of the COVID pandemic is that governments have been looking at this in a much more favorable way than they would otherwise have done. So we see governments across the world trying to respond to the crisis by investment, large-scale investment, and that investment is done into is to be channeled, and that's actually largely happening into the right energy forms, in particular, but other technologies as well. You see this in President Biden's plan, and you see this here, and that is the key thing. And in addition to the governments pledging this, also as green finance for developing countries, very important. That's government money, but it's actually only leveraging the much more important private sector fund money. That the main investment has to come from that private sector, and that requires then, in addition, a clear taxonomy of what is actually desirable finances. All of this needs to be agreed at the international level. COP26 is the right place. So let's hope we get the right outcomes there. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Volker. I mean, you raise a very interesting question when you characterize the global response and the many new policy instruments and economic instruments that are being developed across the world. But it's interesting when and you evoked Joe Biden, the new president of the US, is critical in terms of a unified global response. And yet, one of the questions that came in from the audience prior to us starting was making reference to the former president of the US who denied the existence of global warming. And so maybe I'll come to Sue from the science perspective, just to remind us about the nature of the evidence and ask her the question as a professional educator, how much time and effort, Sue, do you think still needs to be expended to actually educating people about the nature of the problem? And then I think we should then pick up that idea of how impacts are playing out across the world, in the north and in the global south. So first of all, Sue, on the educating people about the problem, tell us what you're doing in your world, please.
Thanks, John. It is a really good question, and I think education of the climate emergency, starts at a very young age in primary schools and through our young people, and we see, the passions that young people have with the growth of and Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion, and our students as, we like to see our students as activists, and we see that as a kind of growing concern, and then using, thinking then through the impacts of climate change on us as individuals, I think is a really good way to look at some of the science, because the science is complex, and there are still unknowns, and how different parts of the ocean and the atmosphere work together and behave in ways that we sometimes still don't absolutely understand. But the use of things like the visualizations of the temperature changes through scientists like Ed Hawkins really are bringing an understanding of the temperature changes to a much wider audience. But I think starting with our young people, and then they then provide the impetus to educate amongst their own families, and then that kind of escalates, and people are really worried about climate. They want to make an impact, they want to do something, and I think that can only be a good thing.
Okay, Okay, thank you, Sue. I think we're going to return to the question of individual agency, but I want us to respond to a number of questions that have been coming in from the audience in respect of agricultural practices, and we've got evidence of extensification and intensification of agriculture in different parts of the world. And I think we saw some questions about exploring the role of animal agriculture on the climate. I think we see some questions about the condition of the soil base within the planet as we go towards increasing levels of intensification and the consequences there may be to soil and biodiversity. And we saw a number of questions, for example, from Siobhan about asking us to specifically consider the role of food in agriculture and land use in both the generation of greenhouse gases, but also as a sink for sequestration. So maybe I'll come to you, Mel. You've done a lot of work in this space, looking at the role of soil and agriculture and growing as a practice of adaptation and response. So do you want to just pick up a number of the questions that are coming forward that we can see in the chat bar?
Okay, thanks, John. Well, in fact, you are the soil scientist, but I'll try to step in as the designer who's been working in that space. I think, first of all, just something I'd like to say about us generally in response to COVID and understanding data. I think we're far more equipped. I'm quite positive. I think we're far more equipped than we ever have been before as a society in understanding the importance of data and looking at data on a regular, daily, somewhat hourly basis at certain points in the last year. So we're more equipped, I think, to understand data, to understand the measures, even if we don't like them, and to maybe understand why certain decisions have to be made. So it's on that basis that I think, from my perspective, I think, you know, we have been working with communities across Europe and in some of the education resources globally. It's clear that many of the people who join in on those courses are really interested in nature-based solutions to some of these problems. So Volker alluded to some of that, and in the UK and specifically in Scotland last year, all of our local authorities published both a biodiversity and food strategy plans as to how we start to move towards a more carbon neutral regeneration of our soils, regeneration of biodiversity. But of course, we're also relying on policy in order to underpin that in terms of some of our big agricultural producers. So it's bringing all of that together, and I can see there are some questions about whether it's unfair for civil community to be held responsible for the climate emergency. I think absolutely, but as Sue has said, many people do want to do something. They want to be able to actually make a difference when issues are starting to touch their lives. So yes, it is unfair for the civil community alone to be held responsible, but I think we can all do something, and we can try to make those changes in our lives that we know can start to make a difference. Coming to the question of soil, of course, the UNFAO announced maybe 5 or 6 years ago, quite controversially actually, that we had only 100 harvests left. But of course, the way in which agriculture has operated is that in increasing intensification. And on the one hand, you could argue that has actually succeeded in driving down the costs of food, and so people can afford to eat. You know, the poorest in our society can actually afford to buy good quality food. But at the other end of the scale, I think there's a real recognition that these things have to change. And I think if any of you do follow James Rebanks, who's famously written a book, he's a herdy shepherd on social media, he speaks very eloquently from his farm in the Lake District about the generations of his family that have managed that land, that, you know, and on the role of agriculture, on the role of animal husbandry in maintaining the soil, but it speaks very eloquently on the change that needs to happen. So there are voices coming through into policy, very much so into society, and I think we recognise all of that, and I'm really hoping actually that the evidence from our own project, the Grow Observatory, that we have communities still monitoring soil a year after funding ends, that data being taken up by climate science and by satellite science, really can evidence that individuals can make a change. You can join a community initiative, you can follow your local authorities' biodiversity and food strategy, and actually contribute to a greater good. So I hope that ties in some of the questions that are appearing at the side there. So thank you. Back to John.
Thank you, Mel. That does tie a number of questions in really very nicely. I think that we have been concerned about climate change for so long. We see evidence of government response now developing. So we've seen even our own Scottish Government publishing its climate change plan as recently as December 2020, which sets the ambition around new targets and emission reduction targets, and tries to situate Scotland as a kind of world-leading climate change country with this target date for net zero emissions to be by 2045. And so we can often talk about the public sector role, about the role of government. There was a very early question from Catherine that is kind of provoking our panel to consider how we channel energy into influencing business and industry to accelerate their progress towards net zero, as well as there's a critical sector, the agriculture sector that we've touched upon. Clearly there's appetite in the public sector and around kind of governmental response, but actually critically we're also going to need individuals and businesses to get on board with that as well. So let me come to you, Volker, if I may, to just maybe begin to address Catherine's question about how we channel energies into influencing business and industry to accelerate towards net zero. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. There are several. This is a very interesting question, and there are several responses to this. Most of us are in one way or another part of a institution that is invested in carbon relevant technologies, and it is therefore up to us to bring about a change in that investment and to push for divestment as well from certain particularly fossil fuels. That's something that's happening, for instance, here at the university. That did happen as a matter of pressure from below. And that's at a large scale true as well. Investment, pension funds, all of them make decisions, and all of them have a choice. What I wanted to highlight as well is that individual consumer preferences in many sectors of the economy are absolutely critical and often overlooked. Now, many of these disruptive technologies are only coming on stream because consumers so want. And you may have followed this. There has been an announcement from General Motors, the largest car manufacturer in the world, that by 2025, that's only 4 years from now, it will have 30 new electric vehicle model on the market. And that's then for everyone. So there will be an electric vehicle to purchase for everyone from that manufacturer. And in fact, that is not because they particularly like electric vehicles. In fact, they make less money on it than on a classic petrol car, but because they have concluded that consumer preferences have shifted in such a decisive way that there is no way they cannot make these new offers. And you could name any legacy car manufacturer doing exactly that. So the fundamental transformative shift in consumer preferences is an absolutely critical avenue where we can challenge our energy. So for each of us, as we make these decisions, we need to consider what they are and what the effects are on the climate change agenda. Thank you.
I was just noting there that the quality of the questions coming through in the chat are absolutely superb, and they're wide-ranging. I'm very interested in picking up the issue of the global nature of the challenge, and particularly the issue that there's a very nice question from Kevin who speaks to Sue's point about vital to educate the young. And I think everybody acknowledges that that's a very valid thing to do. And then there's a question about other generations who may yet be less convinced of the need for a response. And then there's that idea about, well, what can I do? Maybe there's nothing I can do as an individual. And maybe it's, even if I do something, it's the quote, very nice quote, is anything we do is peanuts compared to countries like China who are doing nothing, so why should we? So there is this kind of wider narrative about globalism and about agency at the local level or the individual level. So I'm interested in coming across the panel and maybe just turn to each of you in turn to invite you to just share your thoughts about how you as an individual academic and professional are thinking about ways in which you may be changing your lifestyle or responding to the challenges that we have in an individual way, and how you reconcile your own individual agency in the context of being part of the global community. So not an easy question, I'm afraid, but let me start with you, Pete, about things that you're doing in your life, your understanding of your place in the world, and then the extent to which you feel that you can influence the future to meet the targets that we are setting for ourselves. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. There's something that everybody can do, whether it's the choices people make on what they buy and where they shop, the choices they have in how they spend their time and how they campaign. I was in London during the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations of October 19, and the city was energised by such a broad coalition of people of all ages coming together to share their concerns about a whole wide range of environmental and climate driven issues, and camping in the streets in the city centre and really drawing people's attention to the need for action. And that didn't cost people very much else apart from buying a tent and pitching it on Whitehall. And yet it absolutely drew the world's attention to the crisis that we're facing. And so I think there is something for all of us in this, because if we don't act, then we are complicit in watching what happens. In terms of my own actions, I have converted my own central heating system to a heat pump and bought green tariff electricity. So my own home is zero emissions, for which I'm really proud. I'm about to change my car, and I'm going to get an electric car, I think, this time around. It's an expensive investment, but I think I can afford it. I think I've got the money to be able to make that commitment as well. And so those are kind of big demonstrable choices I'm making. And I'm doing it informed by the WWF's footprint questionnaire, which allows individuals to understand their own contributions to carbon and what their lifestyle choices will make a difference. And so if people want to start there, there's no better place in my mind to just understand what our own contributions are and give hints and tips as to what we could do next. Thanks, John, you're on mute again.
Thank you. It's the story of my night. Let me come to Sue Dawson now. Sue, why don't you share your thoughts on that complex question of your place in the world and what you're doing in terms of trying to change it?
Thanks, John. Obviously, as educators, we have a platform to get our young people understanding data and being able to analyze trends and look at the kind of global picture. And so that we are part of the change movement in that sense. And that's, you know, we have a very important responsibility there to set out not only the climate, but also the potential solutions. And living in and working in and around Dundee, you know, Dundee is one of the most visionary cities in Europe in terms of its electric vehicle use, and that's really powerful. And the city were very quick to convert all of their transportation to electric, the state-of-the-art chargers and run by your apps on your phone and so on. So that is inspirational. I too, like Pete, would like to investigate an electric car, but you know, the cost of the initial cars is more than we would normally pay. So you know, there's a tension between thinking that it would be really good to do that and whether we actually can. I have a personal tension in the use of air travel, which you know, there's a lot of flight shaming. My eldest son lives in Australia. I would obviously like to visit him, but understand the kind of carbon emissions and link to travel. Although I think other parts of the carbon system contribute more, to be honest. So that's a tension. But you know, I try to shop local. I'm vegetarian. I try to walk and cycle as much as I can and limit car use, and you know, ironically, with the pandemic, that's really marked because you know, we barely use our vehicle, maybe once a week to get shopping. So I think as an individual, we can do small things, and collectively that can make a huge difference. We just have to believe that.
Thank you very much, Sue. Excellent point. Volker, I mean, it's interesting that Sue mentions that as an academic community, I think we have historically been very open to the charge of flying around the world and having, you know, lots of conferences and get-togethers, which are and have been historically kind of very carbon heavy in terms of their consumption. I'm interested in your own perspective and your own degree of agency, but you know, I also would like you to maybe just also think about, do you see a future in the academic community where we go back to these multiple international events and we're all jet setting around the world and having these academic congresses and symposia? But first of all, your own position and your own place in the world, please. Yeah,
thank you. John, that's incredibly relevant, also from where I sit, because our center at University of Dundee has been educating international students, almost exclusively international students, for 40 years, with the idea of building capacity. So we have a responsibility to educate that future generation of leaders who are going to back to their country and will make a major difference. And that's something where I can make a difference. You're absolutely right. As an international lawyer, you know, we're used to travel a lot, and certainly the pandemic will have the lasting effect that much of this is not necessary. You can do things online in a speedy way. There is to take up the term that Sue used, there is a tension though. In certain things, you will continue to need face-to-face contact to make really a difference. And the upcoming Conference of the Parties in Glasgow is an example. It's probably not possible to completely do this online. People have to actually sit in the same room, and there is a trade-off, because you have to fly into Glasgow to do these things. But you know, as it is something we have to probably accept in order to make that big progress. And the final point, I wanted to come back to your point about the local and the global, John. Now we all know that compared, you know, Europe is an important player, but it is comparatively small to where the real emission centers in the world are, and they will be only more so. That's Asia and Africa. And if we can't help those parts of the world to make a difference, then this fight is lost. Now, interestingly enough, if I speak to my colleagues there, in particular in Africa, the first question is always, so you're asking us to make a sacrifice or a change. What about yourself? So, in fact, I think you cannot make a convincing argument in asking those colleagues to move ahead if you do not do something very seriously at home. So the argument that Europe is a small player in the global race to carbon zero doesn't really count. We need to show ambition, and we need to show the example, and then also, most importantly, also the readiness to be in solidarity with those who do not have our means. So that's something we clearly should work on in our professional lives. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Volker. And I'm going to give a final, very speedy opportunity for Mel to share her thoughts, because alas, time is against us. So Mel, please.
Okay, thanks, John. So in a very speedy way, I've already talked about the courses that we're developing that are free and open to all, and are designed to engage many people globally. Professionally, I also develop things like this, which is the toolkit, the Citizen Sensing Toolkit, which has all kinds of tools and methods and stories of success that people can take up. So on a professional level, I aim to publish openly data sets, tools, courses, not just for our students, but globally. On a super personal level, and anybody who knows me on Twitter can look it up. I got married a couple of years ago, and I decided that I wasn't going to buy a new wedding dress. I actually found a wedding dress in my village at the second-hand shop, and really strangely, it was from 70 years ago, somebody who was exactly the same size, same height, same frame as me, and it fitted me like a glove. And so that was a story, a success story. It's something very personal that I could put out there. And I got something like 700 or 800 likes and comments on Twitter because of that. So I think it's spreading those small stories of success as well, about things that we can do on a personal level that can really inspire people to take something up. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. An incredibly moving and powerful story there. I think it's very, very symbolic of that whole wider piece around the circular economy and reusing and remaking, and then finding that that's actually just an incredibly important thing to do and enjoy, and it adds to your sense of occasion that you managed to do that. So thanks for sharing that, Mel. So I'm afraid that we are at the end of our time, audience. There's been some fantastic questions that have come through. It's not been possible, I'm afraid, to turn to each of them in turn. We've had a rather wide-ranging and movable conversation, but I think that's in the nature of the spontaneity of our discussions together. What we will do is, I think, try and capture the questions that we've got in some sort of small summary of tonight's events, and we'll put that on the university web pages and share it as a kind of a record of tonight's events, and hopefully address some of the questions that we didn't have a chance to get round to. I hope, as the audience, you would agree that we've had some excellent talks. I'm really impressed by the questions and the cut and thrust, and I know that we saw really nice examples of questions bouncing off each other, and again, I hope you think that we've got to as many of those as we could. I don't think we necessarily have all the answers, but I think we've really got a sense of a community pulling together in the same direction. So I would like to just close by inviting you to join me by thanking our speakers for their talks and their impressive responses to your questions. I'd like to thank you all for your questions, both those that were pre-posted and those that were provided during the session. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to our organising team of Peter, Aileen and Emma, who've made all the complex arrangements and kind of facilitated the choreography to make tonight's event work. Invariably, we have a few technical gremlins along the way, and the convener frequently doesn't switch his microphone back on, but that's also part of the spontaneity of an event such as tonight. So thank you. We're about to switch off the broadcast. We will make a copy available in due course digitally, and we look forward to seeing you at the next of our Saturday series, which are just a couple of weeks away from now. So thank you very much, and good night, everybody.